I'm very delighted to see you in such a large number. So I see that the topic is quite interesting to the larger audience, and I'm very happy and honored to have today with us Anka Slana Ozimič. She's my colleague, and I would like to introduce her first. She is an assistant professor in cognitive science at the University of Ljubljana, where she teaches cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology. She holds a PhD in neuroscience, a master's degree in cognitive science, and a university degree in social pedagogy. She's a member of the Mind and Brain Lab at the Department of Psychology, Faculty of Arts. She's active in the field of cognitive neuroscience and uses a combination of behavioral and fMRI experiments to study cognitive processes related to working memory and cognitive control. Her research efforts also extend into the area of music cognition. Besides to her career as a neuroscientist, she is also an amateur musician. She plays the saxophone and has been singing in various musical ensembles. So, Anka, I leave the words to you now, and thank you for being with us and sharing your knowledge and experiences about sound, music, and the brain.
Okay, so thank you very much. I hope you all hear me. Do you? Okay, so I'll talk about the sound and brain today. I don't know what the introduction was, but anyway, the plan for today is talk about the basics and what these basics are. So what we're going to see is what sound is. We're going to see the difference between pure tones and complex sounds. We're also going to see how the ear process sounds and how the brain process sounds. And we're also going to talk about the babies and the sounds. And of course, during the discussion, we can also open some other debates according to your interests. Okay, so let's start. So at the beginning, I would like to pose a question, which is, if the tree falls in the forest and there is no one to hear it, does it make a sound? And I would like to see what you guys think. So I just launched a poll and I would like to ask you to vote for your answer. I hope you can see the poll. Yeah, I see you see it. I'm already getting some answers. And I'll share them with you in a minute. Okay, so the results. I hope you guys see the results. So the answer, the main answer, the majority of you responded, yes, it does make a sound. Some of you said no, some of you said yes and no, some of you said you have no idea. Okay, I'll tell you the answer in a few minutes, all right? But let's go through some very, very basics right now, and then we'll see what the real answer is. So what is sound? We can talk about sound as a physical stimulus. If we use this physical definition, we can describe sound as the pressure changes in the air or other medium. So let's take, for example, the tuning fork. So you should hear nothing right now. It's just the tuning fork vibrating back and forth. So if we struck the tuning fork on the heel of our hand, the tuning fork starts vibrating, and this causes the air particles to move. So what we get is a denser and more rare areas of the air. So the areas of the air that are more dense in air particles and the areas of the air that are less dense in the air particles. And we can describe these changes in sound pressure with a wave. So for example, in this case, we get this nice sine wave of the movement of air particles or the changes in sound pressure, in air pressure. And this can be described as sound. And if we describe sound as physical stimulus, what happens is we can describe it in terms of frequency or in terms of amplitude. So I'll talk about this a little bit later, but let's talk about another definition of sound. So another definition of sound says that sound is a percept, so sees a sound as a perceptual response. So in this case, sound would be described as the experience we have when we hear. So it's not the actual physical stimulus, but it's the experience of this physical stimulus. So this experience happens in our brain. So if we answer to the, before I tell you the answer, I would just like to say that sound as the perceptual response can be described in terms of pitch and loudness. And pitch is related to the sound frequency, while the loudness is related to its amplitude. So now the tree question. So do we hear a sound if the tree falls and there's nobody there? Well, the correct answer would be actually yes and no. So if we see sound as a physical stimulus, which is changing the pressure of the air, of course, if a tree falls, yeah, there would be a sound, because if the tree would fall, it would move air particles, which would start vibrating, and there would be a sound. But there would be nobody to hear it, right? So if we describe sound as the experience we have when we hear, then the answer would be no. So the correct answer is actually yes and no. Okay, now let's continue. So sound as pressure changes. So this is the physical definition of a sound. As said before, the sound can be described in terms of pressure. And if we describe it like this, we can say that there are two properties of the sound. One is the amplitude and one is the frequency. So if we talk about the amplitude, this simply means the size of the change in air pressure. So if the change in the air pressure is great, the air pressure, if the air particles get denser, the amplitude increases. And if the amplitude increases, we perceive this as being louder. But it's not that simple, as you will see in a few minutes. If we describe sound as frequency, what we mean by that is how many cycles. So this is one cycle. Yeah, this is one cycle. So if we describe sound in terms of frequency, that means how many cycles per second a sound does. So that would be 1 cycle per second. Let's say this is 1 second. And that would be 1 hertz. So the unit for the cycles per second are hertz. So if we would have 60 cycles per second, that would be 60 hertz. And the higher the frequency, the higher we perceive the sound. I hope you're still with me. All right, now I'll show you a few things. So if we describe sound in terms of amplitude, what we see here are 3 different sounds. They all have the same frequency, which is 440 hertz. What that means is that we get 440 cycles per second. So here we only show 25 milliseconds. So all these 3 tones have the same frequency. But what's not the same? It's their amplitude. So in this case, the amplitude is smaller. In this case, it's bigger, and it's the biggest here. So now I would like to play you these 3 sounds and just listen what the difference is. Okay? Okay, so I'll play the first sound, the second, the third. Now you should be able to hear something. Can you just let me know if you heard anything? That would be a really nice
we
feedback.
heard it.
Okay, so what you heard are 3 different tones with the same frequency, but with a different amplitude. And what you probably observed is that the third tone sounded the loudest. So amplitude is related to the perception of loudness. Now let's move to the frequency. So the frequency, now we have 3 sounds, which have the same amplitude. As you can see, they all have the same amplitude, but they differ in their frequency. So we have a sound with the frequency of 220 hertz, 440 hertz, and 660 hertz. And again, I would like to play you these 3 sounds so that you hear the difference. So the first sound, second, and the third. So what you've heard is that if we increase the frequency, we experience the higher pitch of the sound. So this is what the frequency does in a perceptual way. Okay, but you really should know that amplitude and frequency are physical properties, while loudness and pitch are perceptual properties. And now we will talk about this a bit more. So let's talk about frequency, which is a physical property. So again, what we said is that we can have low frequency or high frequency. What we are able to perceive are the frequencies between 20 and 20,000 hertz. So we have a big range of frequencies that we are able to perceive. So these are the sounds that we are able to hear actually. But then we have the experience of this frequency, which is called pitch. So what is pitch? Pitch is actually the perceptual property in terms of which we can order a sound on a scale from low to high. So increase in frequency would mean an increase in tone height. So if we look at the piano keyboard, what we see here in this part are the frequencies. So we see that the tones that are more on the left-hand side have lower frequencies, and tones that are more on the right-hand side have higher frequencies. And if we play these different tones and like go up this up this piano keyboard, we would perceive the sounds to be higher in pitch. And this higher in pitch is actually the difference in the tone height. So the tones that are more to the right have higher tone height, while the tones that are more to the left have lower tone height. But this is pitch. So this is pitch, the perception of the frequency. But then we also have another property of the pitch. So one is tone height, but then the other one is tone chroma. What does that mean? So all these keys that are marked with a letter A have the same chroma. And those of you who are at least a little bit familiar with music and musical theory know that these are the tones that are separated by an interval, which is called an octave. Okay, so these are the tones that are separated by an octave. And we have a musical scale here, and this pattern of the musical scale repeats every seven tones. So we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So now the question is, why would we even name these tones the same way? I mean, they are all different frequencies. So why do we have a pattern of these tones, right? That's an interesting question, actually. So what we actually saw is that tones that are repeated by a ratio of 2 against 1, so meaning that if we multiply a certain frequency by a number of 2, we perceive these two tones as being qualitatively the same. So this doubling in frequency mean that the tones will be qualitatively the same. They will sound the same, they will have similar tone color, although they will be actually different in tone height. So even though the tone height of these marked A's is different, yeah, we still perceive them in a way the same. They have the similar quality to us, and this is called tone chroma. So the tones that are separated by an octave have the same tone chroma. And now I would like to play you these tones so that you can imagine what I'm talking about. If I play you a tone that's like above the 5,000 hertz, you will maybe just only be able to say a difference between two tones that are higher than 5,000 hertz, but you won't be able to say, aha, now this is the chroma A or E or G or so on. Yeah. And this is really interesting. And that's why also, if you look at the piano keyboard, the highest frequency that you can play is around 4,000. And the highest frequency from musical instruments is probably piccolo, which is about 5,000 hertz. So usually the musical instruments don't produce sounds that are higher than 5,000 hertz because we won't be able to differentiate between the pitches. Okay, now let's move to the amplitude, which is also a physical property. We already said that the higher the amplitude, the louder the perception. but it's also a little bit tricky. Before I explain you the details about the amplitude and how we perceive it, also in relation to the frequency, I would just like to say a few things. Well, one is that we can measure air pressure in different ways, or we can describe the changes in air pressure in different ways. So we can measure air pressure in micropascals, so which is one way. Then we can say, we can also describe a relative amplitude, and we can say if a certain sound has an amplitude of 1, then we can say that relative to this sound, another sound would have an amplitude of, let's say, 1000, and so on. So let's say that something that's barely audible has an amplitude 1. So that's something that we can barely hear. An average speaking voice would then have a relative amplitude of 1000, meaning that something that's barely audible compared to some average speaking voice is 1000 times, has a 1000 times higher amplitude than this barely audible stimuli. Now, if the propeller plane takes off, that would have a relative amplitude of 1 million. That means that this would be 1 million times higher, would have a 1 million times higher amplitude than this barely audible stimulus. And if you imagine, if you would need to actually plot these different amplitudes, one having a number 1 and then 1 million, we would probably need some tower or something to actually be able to plot this. That's why scientists decided to convert this amplitude into units called decibels. And they use logarithmic scales. I won't go into this, but something that's barely audible would have 0 decibels, and then some average speaking voice would have it 60 decibels, and then propeller plane at takeoff would have the amplitude of 120 decibels. And if I played you a sound that's more than 140 decibels, I could already damage your ears. So that would already feel painful to your ears. But now let's talk about the experience of this amplitude, which is called loudness. So loudness is a bit tricky, as I said before. It doesn't depend only on this amplitude, it also depends partially on the frequency. What is shown here is an audibility curve. What this audibility curve means, so this is this curve. All the area that is marked in green here means that these are the sounds we can perceive. Okay, we can perceive these sounds. Then the area in the red are the sounds that we cannot hear, so we cannot perceive them. And this area in yellow is already above the threshold of feeling. So those sounds that are above, that are in this yellow area might already hurt us. So now let's talk about this green line. And I would just like to quickly explain what this green line means. So this audibility curve or threshold of hearing, what does it mean? It means that I can hear the tones or sounds that are exactly on this line or higher. The tones that are below this line are the tones that I will not be able to hear. So meaning that if I play a sound that has a frequency of, let's say, 30 hertz, and if I play it with an amplitude of 40 decibels, I won't hear the sound. So if the sound is really low in frequency and the amplitude is not high enough, I will not be able to hear it. And then let's just look at for example, at this tone, which is marked with B here. So this tone would have 100 hertz frequency and the same amplitude as this tone A, but I would be able to hear this one, yeah, because it's above the audibility curve. So everything that's above this audibility curve is something that we can hear. So practical implications of that, I mean, what does that mean? It means that if I want somebody to hear really low frequency sounds, I need to play them in higher amplitude. And when I played that piano to you, those very low notes, so the notes with low frequency, you didn't hear them because they just weren't, their amplitude wasn't high enough. And then there's something else what's interesting. All these tones that fall on this curve, you would perceive them as equally loud, or these tones that fall here. So you would perceive tones that fall on this red line as equally loud. So for example, the loudness of this tone here, so a low frequency tone played with 80 decibels, you would perceive it just equally loud as this one here, which is actually played in much lower amplitude, but has a higher frequency. And this is actually interesting because it shows us that we're most sensitive to frequencies around between 1000 and 5000 hertz. So this is also why the music sounds richer if we play in this area. And this is also why these low tones, so for example, the bass or some instruments that play low notes, should have a little higher amplitude, because otherwise we won't even be able to hear them. So I hope this was clear, because I will return to this at the end when I will talk about what babies hear. Okay, but now let's move on. Okay, so now what we've covered are pure tones. So the tones which we can describe with a simple sine wave function. So they're these simple waves. But now let's talk about the complex tones. So the complex tones don't have this very clear function. So for example, look at this tone. It looks complex, right? It looks complex. It's not pure tone. It's not just a sine wave. But what happens if we look at the frequency spectra of this complex tone is that we see that it's actually composed of different pure tones with different frequencies. So before I explain what that actually means, I would just like to play you this tone and try to remember what you hear. Okay, just try to remember what you hear. So what you actually perceived here was a tone that has a fundamental frequency of 200 hertz, which is roughly G3. Okay, so what you heard was this complex tone. And as I said before, this complex tone is actually composed of multiple pure tones. And these pure tones are the ones that you see here. So one has a frequency of 200, so this is this one. The other one has a frequency of 400 hertz. The third one has a frequency of 600 hertz, and then 800 hertz. So if we play all these tones together, we basically get what I played you before. And I'll show you in a minute how these tones sound like, but I would just like to note a few things. So if we plot this waveform in this other way, in the frequency spectra, what this means is that we plot the frequencies that this tone is composed of. And so here are the frequencies, and here is actually the amplitude. So what we see here is that the amplitude of all these parts is equally high. And these parts are now called harmonics. So these are harmonics of the complex tone. So this would be a first harmonic, the second, the third, and the fourth. And what we usually hear corresponds to the first harmonic. So the pitch tone that we hear corresponds to the first harmonic. So again, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play you this complex tone, and then I'll play all the other fours. Okay, all the other four tones, which are just pure tones. So try to listen again. So the complex one, first harmonic, second, third, and fourth. So if you were really paying attention, what you probably heard is that this complex tone sounded most similar to the first harmonic. You did not hear the complex tone? Okay, I can play it again, okay? Let's play it again. Did you hear it now? I hope. And now let's play it again. So this will be the complex tone. And now the first harmonic, second, third, and fourth. But okay, so we have a participant who didn't hear a complex tone. Did anybody else heard it?
I heard it.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I don't know what happened. But yeah, maybe
majority saw it. Yeah, majority heard it. Yeah.
Yeah, I see it in the chat now. Okay, so I hope you heard it. And I hope what you realized is that this first harmonic sounded most similar to these complex tones, and all the others sounded like they have different pitch, right? And that's very interesting, because if we play all these tones together, then the frequency that we hear actually sounds the same as the frequency we hear in this complex tone. So what turns out is that the pitch tone that, that the tone height that we perceive corresponds to the first frequency. Yeah, so the tone height that we perceive corresponds to the first frequency, meaning that this is actually the fundamental frequency of this complex tone waveform. Yeah, so what we hear in the complex tone is the first harmonic, or the fundamental frequency. Yeah, but still things get a little bit more complicated, and I'll show you that in just a minute. I would just like to say a few more things. One is that this fundamental frequency also corresponds to the repetition rate of the complex tone. So if you look at this complex tone, you will see that the pattern of this tone is repeating, right? And it's repeating at the same rate as the repetition time of this first harmonic. So it repeats basically 200 times per second, which corresponds to the frequency of 200 hertz, which is the fundamental frequency, and which is what we actually hear. So it corresponds to the first harmonic. But then what happens is something funny. So what we have here are, again, two different complex tones. What is the difference? The difference is that this complex tone it's basically this one that you heard before, and I'll play it again. So I hope now everybody can hear it. But this complex tone is composed of 4 harmonics. So 200, 400, 600, and 800 hertz. And then we have another complex tone, but this one only has 3 harmonics positioned on 400, 600, and 800 hertz. So basically, the only difference between these two tones is that this one, the lower one, doesn't have a frequency of 200 hertz. So now the question is, what will I hear? So will the sound to me like it has a frequency of 200 or 400 or what? So I would like to play you these two tones and just listen to them and think about it. Okay, so the complex tone now, in this one. So what you probably heard again was that the tone height sounds pretty much the same, right? So this is weird. So this one doesn't have a fundamental frequency of 200. So it doesn't have a it doesn't have this first harmonic, which we said, yeah, we need it because this is what determines what we will perceive, which frequency we will perceive. But as it turns out, this is not the point. So we can even have the missing fundamental. Yeah, so we don't have the first harmonic, and we will still be able to perceive a frequency of 200. And this is because the repetition rate is the same between these two tones. So even if we remove this first harmonic, if we sum up these 3 frequencies, we will still get a waveform that repeats 200 times per second. So this repetition rate is 200 hertz, and this repetition rate is 200 hertz. So basically, what determines the tone pitch, the tone height that we hear, is this repetition rate and not the first harmonic. And if you look at this difference between these harmonics, it's 200, 200, 200, and here as well, 200, 200. But what differs between these two sounds is, well, they differ a little bit, and I'm going to talk about this in the next slide. This is called timbre. So just listen to these two tones again. So the first one and the second one. So if you were really paying attention, you probably heard a little difference between these two tones, but it wasn't really big. But now I'm going to show you this in this slide. Okay, so complex sounds, we're still here. So these different waveforms can, so what we see is that different instruments have different waveforms. For example, and this is called timbre. This is why if you play G3 on the guitar, sounds different than if you play it on the alto saxophone. So this is actually the frequency spectra of the tone G3, which is roughly about 200 hertz. But it's just represented how the frequency spectra is if you play this tone on the guitar, on the bassoon, or on the alto saxophone. So you can see that some harmonics are higher in amplitude, some are lower in amplitude, and this differs between these different instruments. And this is why these instruments sound different. Now, what I did, I just played around a little bit, and I generated a few sounds which have the fundamental frequency 200. So this is 200, this one has the fundamental frequency 200, and it has 8 harmonics which all have the same amplitude. And then I just randomly did 2 sounds which also have a fundamental frequency of 200, but with different harmonics and different amplitudes of harmonics. And I would just like to show you that all these tones have the same tone height, but they differ in what we call timbre. So just listen to these tones. So it will be first, second, third, fourth. Okay, so the first, second, third, fourth. Oh, that was fourth already. I'm sorry. So I already skipped one. So I hope you heard that they sound different, although the tone height is actually the same. So I'm just going to play them again. Okay, so this is called timbre. So my plan was to also make a little demonstration with the oscilloscope, which is instrument with which we can show the sounds. But I think we should maybe leave this for the discussion. If you would be interested, I will play a few tones on the flute and a few tones on the harmonica, and we can see how amplitude changes, how frequency changes, and how pure versus complex tones look like live. Okay. So if you will be interested in that, we can do that later. But right now, I would just maybe like to go on because I'm not sure if my internet's gonna make it till the end or not. So I hope we should just go till the end and leave this for the discussion. Okay, so what we've covered right now is what is sound. So sound in terms of the physical property and sound in terms of the experience. So sound in terms of physical property, we said we can describe it in terms of frequency and amplitude, while the frequency as we experience it is related to the perception of pitch and to the perception of timbre, and also that amplitude is related to the perception of loudness. Okay, but now we're going to move to the ear. So now it's the ear part, and then the brain part, and then the baby's part. So the ear. I don't want to bore you with too many details about the human ear and how it processes sound, but I think we need to say a few things about that. So as you probably remember from, I don't know, high school or even primary school, is that we can divide ear in the 3 parts: the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. So the first part of the ear is this outer ear. What we see when we look at the ear is the pinna, and we can also have a little look at the auditory canal. What these 2 parts of the ear do are that pinna actually somehow directs the sound into this auditory canal and is in a way responsible, or it helps us localize the sound. And then this auditory canal transmits this sound pressure to the middle ear. So this sound pressure is directed through this auditory canal towards the tympanic membrane, or this is what we call an eardrum. What's interesting about this auditory canal is that it amplifies certain frequencies. So frequencies that are in the range between 1000 and 5000 hertz are in a way amplified. This is also why we're really sensitive to these frequencies. So frequencies between 1000 to 5000 hertz. So when these air particles start moving back and forth, what this causes is that this tympanic membrane or eardrum starts vibrating. What it does then is that it transmits these vibrations through the little bones, through the smallest bones that we have in the human body. We will look at that a little bit later. And then this another membrane, which I'll explain, starts vibrating, and it causes the movement of the fluid in this part, which we call cochlea. Okay, so let's have a slower look at what I just said. So when the air pressure starts moving this tympanic membrane or the eardrum, this is this part, what happens is that these little bones, which we call ossicles, start moving as well. So these bones start moving, and this is filled with air, so these bones move nicely. And what this causes is that it moves the smallest bone in the human body, which is called the stapes, and this bone starts moving the oval window, which is a membrane on the cochlea, which is the auditory organ. So it starts moving this membrane, and there is a liquid that gets moving too. So what's interesting here in this part of the middle ear is that this air pressure is somehow that the signals from the air pressure changes are somehow transmitted to the changes in this liquid. Okay, so this liquid starts moving too. Now, if you can imagine what's actually kind of difficult to understand maybe is that, so air is not as dense as water. Okay, so the liquid, to get the liquid moving, we need more energy. Okay, we need a higher pressure to get the liquid moving. So that's why these bones are getting tinier and tinier. So if we collect pressure from a large membrane and project it to the small brain, what we get is a concentration of this pressure, and this somehow amplifies the sound, and it amplifies it by a factor of about 20 times. So it amplifies the signal that reaches this eardrum by a factor of 20. And that's very important because now we have to move the liquid. So if we want to move the liquid, we need a higher pressure. And this is what these bones enable us to do. So then this bone starts to move this oval window, as I said. Now this is the oval window, and this is the cochlea, the auditory organ, the cochlea. We also have some organ which is related to balance. Here, semicircular canals, but I won't talk about it. So what's important is the cochlea. So if we look at the cochlea a little bit closer, this cochlea, it's called, and it's a snail-like structure which has two main parts, and the upper part and the lower part, and these two parts are parted with something called the cochlear partition. So when this oval window starts moving, the liquid in this cochlea starts moving as well. And now if we uncoil the cochlea, it looks something like this. Okay, so this is the start of the cochlea, which we called the base, and the very end of it, which we called the apex. Now, if we slice through this cochlea, we see something very interesting. What we see is the sound organ, or the auditory organ, called the organ of Corti. And I'm sure you've heard of that before. It's a very complicated or complex organ, but I'll just tell you in very simple words what it does. So this oval window starts moving, and it moves the fluid, right? It moves the fluid here in this cochlea. So if we slice through, what happens is that the liquid filled in this part start moving as well. And this membrane, which is at the bottom part of this organ of Corti, starts moving up and down, while this membrane, which is called the tectorial membrane, starts moving left and right, basically, back and forth. So all these membranes, both of these membranes start moving. And what happens is that we have some hair cells which lie on this basilar membrane, so on this bottom membrane. These hair cells start moving in turn. So they start moving as well. And these hair cells have little processes that go out of the hair cells called cilia. So they move as well. And by this moving, they open or close some channels, which can then enable the ions to flow into these hair cells. And then these hair cells turn on the auditory nerve fibers. So I don't want to complicate your life too much, but what I think it's important to know is that, okay, we have this cochlea, which is a snail-like structure. If we uncoil it, we can see that there in the middle, there is this organ of chordae. And you need to know that this organ of chordae is not just on one part of the cochlea, but it extends from the base to the apex of the cochlea. So this is like a tunnel. And just imagine that this organ of chordae is basically all the way down the cochlea. Yeah, it's all the way down. So when these membranes start moving, because of the air pressure changes, because these bones start moving, the oval window, everything starts moving. It moves the hair cells. The hair cells, the cilia that's attached to the hair cells open up some channels that activate the auditory nerve fiber. So when these auditory nerve fibers are activated, it can send the impulse about the sound to the brain. This might be a bit complicated, but I don't want to say a lot more. But what I do want to say is that this cochlea is a very interesting thing. Why? Because when we produce a sound and when the sound reaches this cochlea, the whole cochlea basically starts moving. But based on the frequency of the sound, certain parts of this cochlea will move more than the others. And as it turns out, is that the parts of the basilar membrane of this cochlea here at the base move more for the higher tones than for the lower tones. So the lower tones move this apex part of the membrane, while these higher tones, higher frequency tones, will move the parts of the membrane here at the base. Yeah, so it's like having a little piano here in our cochlea. So these are, so this part of the cochlea process higher pitch sounds, and this part of the cochlea process lower pitch sounds. And why this is important? Because then if we use this knowledge, we can have a little machine called a cochlear implant, which is very useful for people who are deaf, who have damage to these hair cells that are inside the cochlea and lie on the basilar membrane. So what they do is they can actually insert this cochlear implant, which has many parts, but basically what this implant has is a microphone that catches the sounds from the environment. Then it has some sound processor that divides this sound into different frequencies. And then it has a transmitter that sends these impulses down the cochlea. So what the doctors do is they implant the electrodes into the cochlea. And then if the mic catches the higher frequency sound, they will like activate the electrodes at the base of the cochlea. And if the microphone catches the sounds that are lower, it will activate the cochlea at the apex. And these electrodes will activate nerve fibers. And this is why a person who would otherwise be deaf could hear. What people with these cochlear implants hear is very different, but they can hear anything from just sounds, but some people could also recognize speech, which is very important for basic life functions, right? Okay, so this is about the cochlear implant. Okay, now let's move on to the brain and then to the babies. So to the brain. So again, if you look at this picture, what we have here is the auditory canal and then this cochlea. And what happens then is that when the hair cells are activated, they send signal through the nerve fibers to different nuclei in the brain. So the sound information then travels through multiple nuclei in the brain, and I don't think we should go through them. But what happens at the end, this signal is sent to the primary auditory cortex. So it's sent to the cortex of the brain. And if we look at where this part is, so basically from the ear, when the sound reaches our cortex, so the outermost brain areas, it reaches this part here, which is on the side of the brain in the temporal lobe, and it's called the primary auditory receiving area or primary auditory cortex. So this is the part of the cortex that gets the signals and process them. Yeah, so this part of the brain processes very basic properties of the sound, such as loudness and also the pitch. And again, we have a little piano in our cortex as well, because what turns out is that frequencies that are lower are processed in one part of the brain, and then the frequencies that are higher up are processed in another part of the brain. So it's like having a little piano in our cortex, and this is called a tonotopic map. So basically, we map everything that was processed in the cochlea onto the brain, which is very interesting. And then from there on, the sound can be processed again in different ways. But then we get additional information about the sound. So the brain that processes the location of the sound is in here on the parietal part of the cortex, and brain parts that process what the sound is. So for example, not only if the sound is different in pitch, but also if your mom or dad are talking, or if you hear an elephant, your more frontal parts of the temporal cortex would process that, and then at the end, this information would lead to the frontal cortex of the brain, where you could somehow join this information with other informations that you have from other senses. Okay, so from here on, I don't want to talk about the brain because things get really complicated. So now we just covered how we process sound, but then if you want to talk about how we process music, you would see that a lot of brain parts get activated. But if that would be a question at the end, I also have some pictures prepared where I can show you how the brain processes music. Okay, so if that would be a question, just let me know, please. But now I would just like to go to the last part because I think we're running out of time. So let's talk about the babies. So let's talk about what they hear and do they recognize their mother's voice. So what do the babies hear? And do they hear? So one very interesting question is that do babies even hear? Early psychologists actually thought that babies are kind of functionally deaf, but as it turns out, they of course aren't. And how they did discover this? So when the baby was born, not only born, but when the babies were 3 months of age, they performed an experiment. And this experiment looked like this. A baby went with their parents into the laboratory, and the baby sat in their parents' lap. For example, a baby sat in her mother's lap so that she felt comfortable and safe. And then what researchers did was they played certain sounds to the baby, and they observed the baby. And their logic was, if the baby will show any sign of change, so if he will mimic, or if he will smile or look around or whatever, I guess he or she hears a sound. So they tried to make the environment as quiet and calm as possible. And then when they wanted to play a sound, a little light went on and there was a sound. And they were just looking at the baby. So what they did was they played different sound frequencies, and they played these frequencies at different amplitudes. And they just observed the baby. So they observed the baby, and what they saw was that the baby starts like looking around or grimace or turn their heads around, if the sound was about 200 hertz frequency, the amplitude had to be about 50 decibels in order to somehow get the attention from the child. And then this was at 3 months of age. But for the higher frequency sounds, it was enough that the amplitude was lower. So what they actually got was some kind of audibility curve. And this is something that we saw before, if you remember, when we saw with adults that we are most sensitive to the sounds between 1000 to 5000 hertz, and that certain sounds that are really low frequency needs to be played in really high amplitude so that we can even hear them. So what we see with babies is that, yeah, they apparently hear, and this audibility curve is similar to adults, but their threshold is higher. So they need more input, or the sounds need to have higher amplitudes in order for the babies to recognize it. So these are the 3-month-old babies. But then if you look at the 6-month-old babies, you can see that this threshold is getting lower, meaning that they can already respond to lower amplitude sounds. So they become more and more like adults. And then when they're around 1 year old, they can already, their curve is already similar to the one that adults have. So, okay, apparently babies hear. But then the next question is, okay, we know now we know that they hear, but do they recognize their mother's voice when they're born? And that's also a very interesting experiment. What you see here in this picture is a baby with a headset, and this baby has a nipple. Okay, it has a nipple. And so like a pacifier, and this baby can suck this nipple. So what turns out that is that when babies are breastfeeding or drinking through a bottle or having a pacifier in their mouth, they suck the nipple in bursts. So they suck, 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 and then they have a break. And again, they start sucking and they have a break. And this is known about how the babies suck the nipple. So how did the researchers use this knowledge to check if they can recognize their mother's voice? What they did was they divided the babies into 2 groups. And in one group, what they did was they gave them, through the headphones, they either played the sound of their mother or the sound of a stranger. So they tried to teach the baby to either have longer or shorter breaks between the pauses. So in one group of babies, what they did was, if the baby had a short break between this nipple sucking, they presented the baby with the mother's voice. But if the break was longer, so if this pause was longer, they would present the baby to the stranger's voice. And then in the other group of the babies, they would just reverse it. So the longer break would mean that they would play mother's voice, and the shorter break would mean that they would play a stranger's voice. And what the babies learned really quickly was this association. So the babies somehow modified their breaks according to, so that they could hear their mother's voice. So the group in which the short break meant that they will hear the mother's voice, the babies had really short pauses so that they would then hear the mother's voice. And then in the other group, the babies made longer pauses, because longer pauses meant that they would hear a mother's voice. Meaning that if they could really modify these pauses or these breaks, that means that they must have recognized their mother's voice. I hope this was clear. If it wasn't, we can explain it again in the discussion. Then, okay, now we know that when babies are born, they can recognize their mother's voice. And this was already observed for the babies that were 2 days old. So babies that were basically just born. Then what's also interesting is that in the similar experiment, the researchers found that babies can also modify their pauses in sucking the nipple to hear their native or their mother tongue. So to hear their mother tongue instead of some foreigner language, the babies would also modify their sucking. So the babies didn't only respond to their mother's voice, they also wanted to listen to the sound of their mother tongue. So apparently what babies are trying to do is they want to create an environment which is familiar to them. So they would modify their behavior in order to either hear mother's voice or in order to hear mother's tongue instead of a foreigner language. And I think this is really remarkable. So it's not only about the mothers, it's also about everything else that sounds familiar to them. But then again, another question. Okay, so now we know that when babies are born, they can recognize their mother's voice. But what about in the womb? We know that the ears develop quite early for the fetus. So I think like around 20 weeks of gestation, the babies have already developed ears, and then around 23 weeks of gestation, the organ of corda is already nicely developed. So, but then the question is, can baby hear in the womb? Okay, apparently they can, but can they respond to the voices? So one experiment was that they put a loudspeaker above the mother's abdomen, so above the mother's belly, and they played either a sound of mother reading to the baby or a stranger reading to the baby. And what happened was that babies around 35 weeks old, gestational age, of course, so before they were born, responded much more when they heard their mother speaking than the stranger speaking. What happened was that the babies started moving more when they heard their mother, and that their heart rate went up. So their heart started beating faster than if they were hearing a stranger. So that was also one interesting experiment. And then there are many other experiments with various brain imaging techniques, such as EEG, so electroencephalograph, which measures the electrical activity of the brain. So for example, in one experiment, the researchers exposed a fetus. So when the baby was still in the abdomen, still not born, they exposed a baby to different imaginary words, or to different non-words, basically pseudo words. So for example, they would play a word ta-ta-ta every day to the baby since the baby was around 29 weeks of gestational age. So they would play this sound like every day for a few minutes, ta-ta-ta, or to some other babies, they would play a sound ta-ta-ta. So different sounds. And as soon as they were born, they would put on the EEG cap, and they would measure the brain activity of the baby. And what they saw was that they responded to these sounds, which they should be familiar with, differently than to some other non-familiar sounds. Which means that, yeah, the babies apparently not only heard a person in the womb, but they actually processed real stimuli. So they processed words, meaning that when we are speaking to our baby, babies can already hear us and remember things, even though they're still in the womb. And I think I will actually conclude here.
Thank you, Anka, for sharing the basics of sound perception with us. And thank you to you all to be present here with us. And now I think it's the most interesting part for you to ask questions about sound perception and music perception. So it's your turn now, dear audience.
So please, if you can, use the raise hand function in the chat to ask for word, or you can also paste the question or type the question in the chat if you prefer that.
So I would really like to thank the participants who managed to listen to me just with the slides. I know how difficult that must have been. but I hope that things were interesting enough, or at least clear enough, so that you could understand them. But please, I would really like to tell you something more about the topics that you might be interested in. So yeah, just.
Okay, Anka, I have a question for you from Duje Bonacci, I think. I hope I pronounce it well. Can you talk more about processing music in the brain?
Yeah, okay. So I'm just gonna show one slide, okay? Just a second. I think it will be easier this way. Okay, so I'm just gonna show it like this. Okay, so I hope you see the slide again.
Yeah, we see it.
So yeah, so the slide is not like really nice. Okay. Okay, so where we came to before was, we said that, okay, through from the ear, the sound reaches this primary sound area, right? The primary auditory cortex. But then from there on, there are multiple brain regions that are involved in processing of music. So sound itself is not music, right? We need the combination of different tones played either sequentially or simultaneously to hear the melody or the harmony and so on. And there are different brain parts that are responsible for that. So first we have this early analysis of the sound, and then this sound gets more analyzed in a more complex ways. But then if we, like, for example, either listen to the music or play an instrument, different parts of the brain get involved. So for example, if we listen to the music, right, or play it, we need to move. That's the first thing. If I play the piano, I need to move my fingers. So we would get the motor cortex activated, right? And all these brain areas somehow needs to be connected. So one is the motor cortex. Then the other one is the somatosensory cortex. So this part of the brain is the part that actually gives us the input about the somatosensory, so about the touch, the pressure on the fingers, and so on. So if I play the piano, I need to know how much to press the keys, and I need to get this feedback. So I need to somehow coordinate my movement to the sensory information. Then I need to know about the music rules, right? I need to know about the music rules, especially if I'm like improvising or stuff. And this is the frontal part of the brain is involved in that. Then I also, like, for example, if I play in a band, I also need to see other band members in order to, like, in order to respond to them and to play together. And of course, the cerebellum or the little brain, I need them to like coordinate my movement, to hear the rhythm, to process the rhythm. And then there's many more areas which are not directly related to playing the instrument, but for example, like musical memory, or how I remember procedures, for example, movement of my fingers, because I know the movements, of course, or like how I emotionally respond to music. So there are some little parts or nuclei in the brain that respond, which transmits the neurotransmitters around the brain, and that's why I feel like the goosebumps if I. So there are many parts of the brain that are involved in music. But now I would need like a more specific question to go into other details. So it says again that my internet is unstable, so I don't know if you've heard me.
We've heard you. Thank you, Anka. And we have another question. I have a student with Cochlear Implant. I teach music, so I would love to find out as much as possible about how this works and how people with implant perceive music. Where can I read more about it, but in simple words, so I don't got lost in it?
Okay, so okay, this is this. Okay. Oh yeah. I'm sorry. Do you still see my screen?
Yeah, we do.
You do, right? Okay. So I'll just go to this cochlear implant instrument. Okay, so I'm not an expert in this, I gotta say that. Okay, just wait, I need to share again my screen. Just wait a second. Okay, so you see my screen now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so now this Cochlear Implant. Okay, so I can just repeat what I told you before, but maybe in a more slower pace so that you can actually get it. So the way the cochlear implant works is it has many parts, but basically what it does is first it needs to have a microphone, because this microphone catches all the sounds that are in the external world, right? And then it somehow it has a sound processor that divides these tones that it hears these sounds into frequency spectra, just what we saw before in the complex sounds, right? And then when this processor knows that, okay, we have certain amount of these frequency tones and these frequency tones, it then sends these signals around the cochlea. So it tries to imitate the cochlea. But it's very hard to position these electrodes of the cochlear implant into the correct positions of the cochlea, right? Because like if there is no damage to the ear, these hair cells respond to a certain frequency and then send signals to the brain from a certain frequency. And then this needs to be aligned in the right way, right? So that the electrodes from this implant stimulate the right nerves, so to say it. So can they perceive music? They can definitely perceive certain aspects of the music. But then it's also very important, does the person have cochlear implant in both ears, just one ear? Because, so I'm not really familiar with this. If we have the doctor maybe here, maybe somebody could explain more, but what I would hypothesize is that if it's hard for people to perceive speech, it's probably very hard to perceive very fine differences which are needed to really experience music in the full way. But I'm sure they can experience rhythm, they can experience frequency changes, but do they respond to the music the same way as hearing normal hearing people? That I wouldn't really know. But where you could read more about this, so I gave you the references before, and there is this book. I know that you don't see, I'm just gonna copy the link and paste it in the chat. So this is the copy, which is, I think, there are really basics about the sound. There's also something little about the cochlear implant, but you have many references there. So maybe you could just check it there. But like from my head, I can't tell you a great literature about that. So I hope this helps.
Thank you, Anka. And as Paulica already wrote in chat, in our second cycle in autumn, we're going to address different groups of children with special needs. And we're also going to talk about teaching music to deaf children. So that's going to be topic in autumn. And we have another question for you, just to come here. Dear Anka, can you tell us more about the effect of rhythm or rhythmical patterns on babies and toddlers?
Okay, so this question is probably not about how the toddlers process rhythm and rhythmical patterns in the brain. I guess it's more about how they respond to it, if I understand this question correctly. So about the brain, I can't really say a lot because I'm not an expert in the, okay, can be both, in the rhythm part of the music. What we do know is that, of course, motor cortex and the cerebellum, so the little brain, are involved in processing of rhythm. So as we grow older, these parts of the brain get more and more developed, and they get more familiar with processing the rhythm. But about the responding of babies to the rhythm, what I mean, I don't know the literature about this topic, so I don't think I'm the right person to be telling you about this. But
Katarina Zadnik will cover this topic, so it's going to be explained in few lectures later.
Yeah, but from what I do know is that babies process rhythm quite early, actually, and they can you know, like move their heads on the rhythm. They can respond to the rhythm, to different rhythms. So it seems that they respond to rhythm quite early. I think there was even some research that showed that already babies in the womb can respond to rhythm, to different rhythmic patterns.
I know research studies that talk about how do you say, synchronizing babies' movements with the rhythm already in the womb, as you said, Anka. Yeah.
No, okay, Katarina, do you still hear me?
Now I do hear you, yes.
Okay. So I was just listening to you. Maybe it was delay, but yeah, exactly what you said, that about the synchronization, yeah, about the rhythmic patterns already in the womb. Yeah, so this is something that the babies seem to be able to do quite early. Yeah.
And it's another thing that with regard to preferences, children prefer faster music. And if you teach them, this is one educational implication. It's easier for them if they hear rhythm in more faster tempo than in slower tempo. So that's another interesting thing about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question, Anka. If fundamental tone is missing when several harmonic tones are present, we hear fundamental tone. Is this the Tartini's tone?
Oh, I don't know what is Tartini's tone, unfortunately. So I don't know. I can't answer to this. I'm sorry.
Victor, if you could maybe explain what Tartini's tone is?
I read about this, and the Tartini was a composer who I think used this feature that when harmonic tones are used, you can hear the lower tone which was not played.
Huh.
Yeah, well, then this is probably the missing fundamental. I just never heard that this might be another name of that. So I don't know.
Okay.
But yeah, there is also something interesting about, if I can just add something about these missing fundamentals, that's pretty impressive, actually. When we talk through the phone, right? If we talk with someone through the phone, what the phone can transmit are the frequencies that are actually higher than 300 hertz. But we know that the speaking range is somewhere around 100 to 200 hertz. So how can we even hear somebody speaking, right? If the tone can only transmit sounds that are, or frequencies that are above 300 hertz. So if there wouldn't be this missing fundamental effect, we wouldn't even be able to hear it. So these are some practical implications of this missing fundamentals. So because there are a lot of these harmonics above 300 hertz, we can still hear a person or another sound in the frequency as was presented, basically.
Yeah. Okay, Anka, I read that babies temporarily lose their ability to locate source of the sound between 2nd and 4th month of age. After that, it gets better again. It's presumed that in this period, another part of brain takes over this task. Did I remember it right? Can you tell more about it?
Really, I'm sorry, but I can't really tell you more about it. I'm just not sure what you mean that another brain part takes over this task, meaning that localization is taken on by another brain part, or do you mean that some other brain part is busy doing something else and that's why the babies cannot really locate sound? Because I mean, the location of sound it's a tricky question. One is that there are multiple ways by which we can locate sound. I don't know how exactly this develops, but one is, as already said, the peni. They already help us in certain degree to locate the sound. Then we have the Olivary Nucleus, which is in brainstem, which again helps us locate sounds.
I would really like to thank you, Anka, for sharing all the knowledge with us. As you can see from the chat options, our audience was really inspired with all the info that you get us acquainted with. So thank you so much, and thank you all the participants that came together today and were discussing also with us. I have to tell one thing more, that every part will be organized like this, that first part, we're gonna talk more about theoretical topics, and the second gathering is gonna be more practical one. So the next time we're gonna deepen this discussion with two experts. One is music pedagogue Albinca Pesek, who is also sound therapist, and with Zvezdan Pirtošek, who is neurologist, who explores also a lot about music and the brain. So we're going to prolong this discussion the next week. So thank you all for being here with us and to share all this knowledge. Thank you, and I wish you good night.